Hello everyone and welcome to a complete beginner's guide to getting into orbit for the first time in KSP2. So this is designed for people who really have never played KSP or KSP2 before, and I'll be walking you through exactly how to put your first ship into orbit. Now, I'm aiming this to be a very basic level guide, so I'll be going through everything step by step. I'll be putting time cards down in the description so you can skip along to any sections you find more relevant to you. Anyway, let's get started. So first things first, we need to jump into a game. I'm recording this in April 2023, so only the Sandbox campaign is available to us, but that's absolutely fine. That gives us everything that we need. Okay, so once we've loaded in, we want to go over here to the vehicle assembly building. This is where we're going to design our rocket. Now, the main currency that we're going to be keeping in mind here is this green delta V line down in the bottom right corner. Delta V is really your vessel's ability to change its velocity. The higher the delta V, the bigger a difference you can make in your velocity, and so the further out in space you can go. Really moving from one position to another in space is not really to do with sort of the time it takes to get there, but how much you can change your velocity in order to change your orbit. Now, very nicely in KSP2 we do have the delta V continuously computed, and down here in the lower right we've got this very nice trip planner, and if we click on that it brings up this panel here where we can enter where we want to go to, always from Kerbin in the current build. In this case we don't need to worry too much about this because all we really need to look at is this top line here, Kerbin low orbit. This has a delta V of 3,400, meaning that if we have a spaceship with 3,400 total delta V, we should be able to get into an orbit. You can make this easier for yourself if you give yourself a little more delta V. That'll let you make a not quite perfect ascent, which is probably what you're going to be trying to do if you're watching this video. So with that as our goal, we need to start setting up our spaceship. I'm going to do a manned spaceship here. Keep things nice and easy, let's just go for the very small Mark 1 tin can. Click on that once. There we've got our actual manned module. So this is what we're going to try and get into a stable orbit, and then ideally deorbit and descend. Now, keeping in mind we're wanting to deorbit, that is get back out from orbit, we are going to need to think about survivability. So if we go down to utility here on the left hand side, we want to put on a parachute here, and this extra small Mark 16 parachute is perfectly good for this really small capsule that we've got. Now, although it's not implemented in the current version, I am just going to kind of future-proof this for when thermal heating is added to the game, and we're going to pop on a heat shield. Nice thing about re-entering any planet with an atmosphere is you don't actually have to pay the delta V cost to slow down. Instead, you can make the planet's atmosphere do that for you. The downside is, as you're coming in, you're having to slow down a lot, which means all of that kinetic energy you have has to go somewhere, and all else failing, energy tends to be transferred into heat, and so we need to do something about the massive amount of heat that we're going to be generating. And so we whack on one of these heat shields. Again, I'm just going for the SM size, the small size, since that will match our form factor of everything else here. And all this is a material that is going to be able to withstand the very high temperatures of compression heating as we're coming back in, and at the same time it's got an ablator, meaning that if the temperature raises too high, small little parts of this will begin to evaporate off, and in doing so they carry away some of that energy, essentially giving you a little bit of a shield against the energy you're bleeding off. So right, this is what we're planning on coming back to Kerbin in. Now, we need to attach this to everything else that's going to put us into orbit. And to attach various different components of your spaceship, you want to use couplers. So over here, if we go to coupling, we've got this series of different possible parts that we have. And we're just doing a nice small rocket. We don't need to worry too much about forcing the stages apart, so we can just use these stack decouplers. put one on the bottom there, and all this does is give us the option to essentially break this stage apart. It will let go of both sides, separating our rocket into a smaller chunk. So now we need to think about, well, how are we actually going to get this into orbit? And in general, what you want to use with really any kind of rocket is to have several different stages. The idea here is that when you're launching a rocket into space, you're burning fuel to change your delta V to accelerate, but the amount of acceleration you get is hindered by your mass. Going back to GCSE level physics, force equals mass times acceleration, and so for a given amount of force you're applying, acceleration is force over mass. The bigger the mass, the smaller the acceleration you get. So ideally you want your rocket to be as light as possible. So I could just put on an absolutely massive fuel tank, launch us into orbit on that. The problem is, towards the end of that, what I'm doing is carrying a mostly empty giant cylinder that is really heavy, and I'm having to accelerate that all the way. So instead, what I want to be doing is dropping off the empty fuel tanks as soon as possible as I'm going up to lighten the load so that I'm getting the most efficiency from my fuel in each stage. If you didn't follow that, the rule is really quite simple. Ideally, you want to be keeping the stage as small as possible as you're going up. So if I go over here to fuel tanks, in KSP we've got a variety of different types of fuel we can use. Got methalox, methane, monopropellant, xenon and hydrogen. Now, nice and simple, for rocket launches, methalox is the one you want to use. Again, this may well change. There are other rocket fuels that are used in real life for this sort of atmospheric stages. For now, methalox is the only equivalent that we have. All this is methane and oxygen. Methane is your combustible fuel. Oxygen is your oxidizer. You take a fuel plus an oxidizer, it creates a reaction. The energy from that reaction is what's pushing you up. The other fuel types here are for more specialised versions, so methane just has the fuel, doesn't have any oxidizer. This is what you want to use if you are doing air breathing, so taking oxygen from the atmosphere. That'll be if you're doing a plane, essentially. Monopropellant is a nice simple fuel really used for thrusters to change your direction more than actual acceleration. Xenon is for fancy, very high efficiency, very low thrust space engines, and hydrogen here is used for nuclear engines. So in this case, methalox is what we want. Again, let's just stick with the small form factor here, and what we're looking for in this upper stage is really just something that once we're out and near orbit, we want this to be able to just push us over the edge to get in that final orbit. So I'm just going to put on this FLT200 tank. So that's our fuel tank, but we need some actual engines on this. And again, your engines are ordered by the type of fuel that they use up. So here's our methalox engines. These are the ones we want to use. And we've got all sorts of other varieties here, jet engines, which will use your methane, monopropellant, xenon, hydrogen, so on. So we just want to stick here. Now, if you hover over any of these engines, you get this whole series of different statistics. Now, most of those we don't really have to worry about too much at this point. Really what we're interested in is two main factors: the max thrust and the ISP. The max thrust tells you how much force the engine can generate, how much thrust it's generating. The bigger this number, the higher your acceleration. The ISP tells you essentially how efficient your engine is. The higher the ISP value, the more acceleration you're going to get for a given amount of fuel. And you want to balance these two. You need enough thrust so that you don't, say, fall back to Earth, or fall back to Kerbin in this case, but ideally you want as high ISP as possible so that you're making the best use out of that really heavy fuel that you're taking. And you can also see here there are two different values for each of these. The first one is at 1 atmosphere, so this will be the engine's thrust and ISP at sea level. And then you've got a vacuum value for both. So here we can see this Terrier engine. In vacuum, it is about twice the thrust and about twice the ISP, meaning that this Terrier engine is really, really good for doing space things. On the other hand, we have something like this Reliant. Now, this has a lower ISP in vacuum, higher ISP in atmosphere, and much higher thrust. So this is better for the stage that's going to be lifting us off from the ground and getting us closer up towards space. So this is a section that's going to end up in space, so I just need this nice energy efficient Terrier engine. And as I put that on, if we look down here, my delta V has changed. I'm now 1,301 meters a second. Remember, I wanted to aim for about 3,500, so this looks like I'm a good chunk of the way there. So you may initially think as well, if I'm just about 1/3 of the way there, why don't I just put on another one of these? Then I'll be almost there already. Well, we've got two problems there. The first is, if I just copy this, and I can copy this by holding Alt and clicking on a section. So if I hold Alt and click on this top stack separator here, I get an exact copy of that and all of the components attached to it. I can click on the base, put that on. Now that I've done that, I've not doubled the amount of delta V I've got. I've only gone up an extra 700. And the reason for that is this lower stage, although it has the same amount of fuel as the upper stages, it's also having to push a much heavier rocket. It's having to push itself and the upper stage and the pod, and so we're getting less fuel efficiency there. And on top of that, we're going to get a lot less effective thrust out of this. We've got the same overall thrust, but we've got a larger vehicle, so we're going to get less acceleration. So really, as you go down your rocket, what you want is your fuel tanks to become larger and larger, and for the engines to become larger and larger in order to lift the heavier and heavier rocket that you're sending up. So I'm going to delete that. So again, click on the stack separator that I added, move it to the side and just hit the delete key. Okay, so if that's not what I'm wanting to do, I do still want to put on a stack decoupler here. So same thing, put that on the bottom. What we'll see very nicely, if you put on any stack separator onto an engine, it will automatically put a little fairing around it, this little shield that just covers it, makes it look nice and neat, and provides some strength going through it. Now I want to have a larger fuel tank here, so again going over to fuel tanks, Methalox, can do this FLT800 engine, or fuel tank I should say. There we go, much larger fuel tank. And now I'm going to need to put on a bigger engine. This is going to be igniting down in the atmosphere, so I'm mostly wanting to look at the ISP in atmosphere value, but I also want to make sure that the thrust is going to be high enough. So we can see the big problem with the Terrier, although it's really efficient, only has a thrust of 30 kilonewtons. This Reliant, on the other hand, has a thrust of 200 kilonewtons. And we can go even higher than that. This Vector engine here, really massive thrust. The other thing to keep an eye out for here though is the top stat, the mass. Some of these engines are a lot heavier. For example, this Vector engine is 4 tons, compared to 1.2 tons for the Reliant. Now, that's absolutely fine. If your rocket is already really heavy, then it doesn't matter too much how heavy the engine is. But if we've got a relatively light rocket, then the weight of the engine really is going to make a big difference to getting you out of orbit. So for now, let's just try the Reliant. And so now we're almost there. We've got 3,100 meters per second, and if we want to get some more information, we can click on this little note down here, the engineer's report. Here we get information of our total mass, the various other stats, the number of parts, height, weight, length, but a really important factor here is this, the thrust to weight ratio. So as you said, your engines produce thrust, the amount of pushing power they have, and your entire rocket has a certain amount of weight. It is being pulled down, just like you are right now, towards the centre of the planet. And so what we need is an engine powerful enough to lift up this large rocket. If your thrust exactly equals your weight, then thrust to weight is 1, and that means that your engine is just strong enough to cancel out the force of gravity, meaning that your rocket can hover in place, but it won't accelerate. If your thrust to weight ratio is higher than 1, you will start to go upwards. And in general, the higher the better, although extremely high levels of thrust to weight can cause problems with your rocket kind of coming apart. So what you can see here is my thrust to weight ratio is 2.55. That's absolutely plenty. I generally aim for about 1.5 as a good rough rule of thumb here. So this being really big, and us not quite having enough delta V, we can put these two together to get a bit of a solution. I can add more fuel tank here. So I take off the engine that I put on, put on another one of the FLT800 engines, put the engine back on. Now here we go, these numbers are looking much better. Our total delta V is now 4,000. Remember we needed 3,500, so this is right spot on and gives us a little bit of wiggle room in case we don't make an ideal ascent. And thrust to weight ratio is still above 1.5, meaning we're going to make a nice, quite nippy launch off the launch pad. So this rocket should get us up, should get us into orbit. We can make some things a bit easy for ourselves, and one of the things that I like to do is go over here to aerodynamics and put on some stabilizers. So one of the biggest issues people have early on getting rockets up is the tendency of rockets to flip over upside down. That's not going to be too much of a problem with this nice simple rocket, but as your rocket gets more and more complicated, in particular as the centre of mass starts to shift, very often you can have issues with the rocket just starting to spin over, and once it starts to spin it will just continuously spin. Easiest way to stop that is to put some little stabilizers on the bottom. Now in KSP2 we've got 3 different varieties here. We've got wings, stabilizers and control surfaces. Really any of these will do for our purpose here, the difference being how much of the wing moves. So stabilizers are fixed things. Control surfaces, the entire surface will move in order to help right the craft. Wings, most of it stays still, a little bit will move. Just to make things nice and easy, and because the current version of KSP does have some issues with control surfaces, I'm just going to whack on a stabilizer. We don't need much, we just need to go to this extra small one. Now if I just put one of these on, we're going to make a lopsided aircraft, and that's going to make this far, far worse. So instead what I want to go down to is this symmetry mode, and click on it. If I push that once, I'm now on 2x symmetry, and so this is going to put down one and another in a matching position on the other side. Click again and again, I go to 4x symmetry. That's going to put 4 equally spaced fins on. If I just put this down at the bottom there, that is really all we need. All these really do is add a little bit of drag to this back of the rocket, and that's going to make this part of the rocket want to be pointing away from the direction we're going, which is exactly what we want. We want this base end of the rocket to be pointing down towards the ground. We want the top end here to be pointing in the direction we're moving. So that's our rocket designed. If you want to name it, you can do so up here. Just click there. Name it whatever you like. You can save it if you want to. Always a good idea just to double check before we launch. Really want 2 things to check. One is check the engineer's report, make sure everything there is looking good, so thrust to weight is correct. It's exactly what we want. The other is this little sidebar here. This is your staging. This is the sequence of commands that your rocket is going to receive as you're going up in the air. It starts down here at the bottom with stage 1, and then each time you push the staging button, which by default is space, it will advance up the next one. And so if we hover over any of these, it will show you what is going on. So here in stage 1, we're activating our initial engine. That's exactly what we want. When we hit stage 2, this decoupler over here is going to fire. That's going to separate these two segments. Here we've got a bit of an error, we've got a blank position, that's fine. If you ever end up with a blank, it's just due to how you've put the rocket together. You can just hit this little minus arrow. Then we are going and activating our space engine, and then once that space engine is done, we can activate and break off this stack separator. And then very finally, this stage will only be activated by us when we're coming back in. We can turn on the parachute. And so that's the order that we want to do this. We'll see this as we actually do the ascent. If any of these are in the wrong order, say for example, you had set it up and it ended up looking like this. So here we're separating the stack first, then igniting the engine. That's really no good because you're going to break off the top section. That engine then is no longer attached to you. You can't control it. You won't be going up into orbit. To reorder this, all we need to do is click on any of the numbers and drag down. We can reorder them like that. You can also put multiple components on the same stage. So let's say I wanted to have my separation and the second engine happening at the same time. I can just click and drag my engine here from number 3, drag it down to number 2. Now, when I hit this stage, both of these are going to fire at the same time, so I will release the separator and ignite the engine. That can be quite useful if time is a concern, but I generally prefer to have them on separate values, so I'll drag that back to number 3. And final thing before we launch, if we just go over here to the Kerbal Manager, we can pick who we are putting onto this thing. In this case it's auto-selected Valentina, so let's just leave Valentina. At this stage in the game there's no real difference between any of these are absolutely interchangeable. That may well change as things go on, we start to get crew skills. So anyway, now we're ready, we can click launch and we'll move over to the launch pad. So we've got a little bit of wobbling here. That is just because we are resting this on its engine. It's not the ideal way, but it should be absolutely fine for our purposes here. So now, the actual launch. I'll go through the theory of getting into orbit first, and then we'll have a go at it. So if we push M, we go over to the map view. Now what's going to happen as we launch, we begin to accelerate up and up and up. The problem is that we cannot get into orbit just by going straight upwards. Because no matter how far we get from the planet, unless we get ridiculously far from the planet so that we escape the effect of its gravity, all we're going to do when the engine stops running is we're going to start to fall back down towards the planet. What goes up must come down. And as long as we are anywhere in this large bubble here around the planet, we will always be falling towards Kerbin. But that's fine, orbit is not about getting to a position where you're no longer falling. Orbit is all about getting into a position where you are falling, but you're moving fast enough sidewards so that you never hit the planet. This will become a little more clear once we've got our various displays once we start making orbit. But for now, the key part to note is that what we want to do is not just get up into space, we also want to be moving sidewards really, really, really fast. Now this is a bit of a balance because we don't just want to immediately come off the pad and start heading sidewards, because the atmosphere is really thick down here near the surface, which means it's going to be giving us a lot of drag, slowing us down, wasting our fuel. Which means we do want to get into space, where there is, at least in KSP, no drag whatsoever, and then we want to be going sidewards, and it's a bit of a balancing act. You don't really want to go straight up and then sidewards, you want to do a little bit of a curve, what's known as a gravity turn. Now what that means for us is when we launch, we're going to initially be going more or less straight up, and then we're slowly going to turn over to the side. Now here in the lower left, we have our nav ball. This shows us what direction we're pointing in. Right now, we are pointing directly up. See that by the big ball being entirely blue, it's orange on the other side, which would indicate we're pointing towards the ground. And we have these various markers on for the various angles that we're making. Now what we're going to do is take off and slowly pitch over to the right so that we are pointing slightly towards the 90-degree angle. The reason why we want to point to the 90-degree angle is because we're starting on Kerbin's equator, and Kerbin is spinning slightly. Just like Earth, it spins heading towards the east, meaning that we've already got a little bit of speed here being on the surface. We're already heading towards the east a little bit, so we may as well make the most of that and keep heading, and we're going to end up in an eastward orbit around the planet. Now, by default in KSP, SAS here is on. That's fine. You generally want to make sure this is on. This is your automatic stability assist system. This just helps you point in the direction you currently are. We'll certainly use this for other things in future tutorials, but for now we just want to leave this on as it is, and we don't need to touch any of this. Now, KSP does have a countdown system, so when we click this big green go button or press the spacebar, it will begin counting down. When it hits 0, it will launch, and then we're immediately in control of the craft. So without further ado, let's do that. So click go. Get the nice countdown, get some nice special effects as it's getting close. And then we have ignition. Now all I'm going to do is use the W, A, S and D keys to pitch us over ever so slightly to the right, so I'm just tapping D occasionally. We can see on the nav ball that is starting to move the little white marker slightly to the side. You can also see that visibly here that we are starting to pitch over to the right. At this point I'm just holding right. And we're steadily going up. Now one thing I want to look at is this AP with an altitude here. This is my apoapsis. This is the height that I am going to reach if my engine shuts down now. And so we can see, even though I'm currently only at 11 kilometers high, my apoapsis is sitting at 35 kilometers. It's because I have enough momentum to carry me up and over. Now this, I very much want to be at least 70,000, because that is the upper end of Kerbin's atmosphere in KSP. I'm reaching 100 here, so I'm going to hold control. That slows my engine to a complete stop. That's because I've got plenty of speed here to come out of the atmosphere. We can see that on this curve here. I'm coming out the atmosphere, hitting this point here, and then I'll fall back down. Now that I'm very high, here 50,000, I'm going to pitch right over towards the horizontal and press shift to ignite my engine again. Now that wasn't a great orbit, I was struggling to turn over. Ideally you want that curve going through from vertical to being exactly on the horizontal to be a lot smoother than that. But here I'm just going to burn the last, and you can see my engine is shut down there. I'm out of fuel in this large tank. That's absolutely fine. I still have 1000 delta V left. It is just in the next section. And so what I'm going to do is press space once. I decouple that stage. And then I'm going to press space again to ignite this stage. And I just press shift and control to adjust my thrust. In this case, I am quite far from the apoapsis, so we can take a little bit of time just to talk about what we're doing here. So ideally, what we want to be doing is burning at this apoapsis point, and what we want to be is here, burning exactly 90 degrees to the plane of the planet. In doing that will give us more and more horizontal velocity. I'm going to begin burning here just to demonstrate. So as we are burning here, pushing us in this direction we're moving, we can see that our predicted course is moving. We're falling at about the same rate, but what is changing is we are moving more and more horizontally before we crash back down into Kerbin. Now, eventually we're going to reach a point where this curving arc that we have is going to curve all the way around the planet to the other side. Now I'm just going to stop that there. What we can see is my apoapsis has gotten quite far ahead of me, and that's not ideal. If you're wanting to do a orbit, you want to be burning at your apoapsis. The reason for that being is whatever engine change you do now is affecting your orbit on the other side of the orbit. In this case, if I burn at my apoapsis, I will be changing where I will be at my periapsis, the other side. We can't see that part of this curve now because it's currently within the planet. That's fine. I can just speed up time, and what we can do if we don't want to wait the 4 minutes to reach the apoapsis is I can just click on any points here and click time warp to point. Then it will just accelerate time until I reach there. Now I want to make sure I'm pointing in the right direction here, and notably what we can see is this little green marker on the nav ball. This is our prograde marker, which is fancy talk for the direction we are currently moving in. And we want to be pointing in the direction we're currently moving in. I can either do that with WASD, or I can do so with my SAS controls here. If I click this prograde, I will automatically turn and point in the direction we're moving in. Now I just start thrusting again, we're at the apoapsis. You can see us increasing the orbital curve here as it goes round. Now all of a sudden you can see that in theory we would be going around this planet without hitting it. We're going so fast sidewards that by the time we would be hitting the planet here, we're just curving around it. Bit of a problem is that our periapsis is only at 46 kilometers right now. We don't want that. We want this to be above 70, otherwise we're going to re-enter the atmosphere, slow down and crash. So keep thrusting a little bit. There we go. Periapsis is now above 70, meaning that we are going to stay above the atmosphere for this entire orbit. Periapsis and the apoapsis are above the atmosphere. In this case, we can talk about the definitions. Apoapsis is simply your furthest point from the center of your orbit. Periapsis is the closest point. So in this case, we are going 184 kilometers at our highest, 85 kilometers at our lowest, but we will just keep this pattern going on and on and on infinitely until we do anything about it. And in this situation where you're going around the planet fast enough that you never actually hit the planet, this is when you're in an orbit. Press M to drop back to our view looking at our capsule, and we can get some nice pretty views there. But ultimately what we want to do is get back to Kerbin, and so let's give us one full orbit, and then we will think about slowing down. So to slow down we just need to do the opposite. Burning prograde is going to increase the height that you will be on the other side of the orbit. Burning retrograde will decrease the height on the other side of the orbit. One of the very tricky things to get used to about orbital mechanics is when you're burning the engine in one position, you're not changing that position of the orbit. You can't. That's where you currently are. That is fixed. What you're doing is always changing the opposite side of the orbit. So you always have to think about moving at the opposite point to where you want the actual change to occur. Now here, to make this easy, I want to bring our periapsis down below the height of the atmosphere. That will mean that we will re-enter the atmosphere, slow down and come to a stop. If I want to move the periapsis, I want to be burning at the apoapsis. And to lower the height, I want it on retrograde. So that is fine. All I need to do is click here and do time warp. We'll do one full orbit. Don't worry about the speed changing, it will just change the time acceleration automatically as you get close to the planet, just in order to avoid any weird issues with time acceleration. Right, then if I click retrograde, I will turn around. You can see that happening on my nav ball. And then I can press shift and we'll see that the periapsis is steadily decreasing. Now, the exact height that you aim for depends on your current velocity, depends on the mass of your ship, but in general, a good rough figure to aim for is about 30 kilometers. That will normally be enough to slow you down to a complete stop, but without burning up too much. And I am including that talk even though the current version of KSP2 doesn't include re-entry heating. I'm sort of future-proofing this video for anyone who is watching this in the future. So the problem is, if you have this too low, you will be entering at too sharp an angle. You won't have enough time to slow down completely before you hit the surface. What you want is the atmosphere to be nice and gently slowing you down, rather than the ground, which will very rapidly slow you down, which is not very good for your survival. At the same time, you don't want your periapsis to be too high, otherwise you won't slow down enough. You will come into the atmosphere, begin slowing down as you enter the atmosphere, but if you still have too much speed, you will come out the other side of the atmosphere and go round for another orbit. Sometimes that is not too bad, you'll just re-enter on the next approach, but sometimes it can be very bad as you don't have too much control over what is going to happen after that. The next orbit you might slow down a bit too much and end up crashing somewhere you don't want to. Now that we've got that all lined up, we are in a really good position just to head back to Kerbin. Now we have no more use for the rest of the fuel here, and so just to make things easy, I'm going to decouple this stage. We could try re-entering with this stage. The problem is that this is big and heavy, and this has a couple of effects. One is, because this is big and heavy, our parachute will struggle with it. But on top of that, the heavier your capsule is as it's re-entering, the longer it will take to slow down, therefore the larger the re-entry heating effects is going to be. You want to minimize the momentum of what is re-entering, because that is really what you're having to bring to a stop. So as light as possible makes it as easy as possible. Then on top of all of that, I've got my heat shield between these two. It needs to be exposed to the atmosphere to do anything, so let's just decouple here, so press space once more. There we go, that is just going to float away. And we are just going to drift in behind it. Now again, what I can do is just time warp to a position in the future. And the game will automatically stop time warp as soon as my altitude drops below 70. Or at least it will slow time warp. I'm going to slow this to a stop, clicking here 1 times, so now I'm no longer under any time acceleration. Now what we want to make sure is that our heat shield here is pointing into the airstream as we're approaching. The part that is impacting the air, this is the part that heats up. As your craft comes in, you are moving faster than the air can get out of its way, and so you begin to build up a really high pressure region of air right in front of your craft, and as you pressurize air, it heats up. Just think about an aerosol can. As you're spraying that, the can cools down. That's because you're depressurizing air. This is the opposite. As you put in pressure, it gets heated up, and that is called compression heating. That is what causes all the nice pretty flame effects, which unfortunately we don't have in this version. But either way, we want this heat shield to be pointing directly at that big pocket of high pressure air there. To make sure we're doing that, we want to have this aligned retrograde. That means the front of our craft is pointing away from our direction of travel, therefore this butt of our craft is pointing towards the direction of travel. At this stage there's not too much to do other than look at the very pretty sights of KSP2 and watch as our altitude starts to decrease. Now already we can see one thing happening here. Our orbital velocity here on the left, which we've not really looked at up till now, this tells us how rapidly we're moving with respect to the planet. And this is actually decreasing. even though we are losing altitude, normally as you lose altitude, your orbital velocity increases, and vice versa. Conservation of energy, if you're decreasing gravitational potential energy, you're increasing kinetic energy. We've got the opposite here, we're dropping down and we're losing speed. That is because of the air resistance. You can see this is steadily bleeding off our speed as the air is resisting our movement, or other way of thinking about it, our kinetic energy is slowly being lost into that heat energy that we are generating. That's exactly what we want. We want to convert as much of our kinetic energy and dissipate it elsewhere before we hit the ground, because we don't want much kinetic energy when we hit the ground. Now at some point we'll have nice fancy effects for this. We'll have big flame effects as we're heating the air, we'll have big supersonic shock cones going on as we are pushing through the atmosphere. We don't have any of that right now, so this is all a very, very simple view. We really can't see the massive forces that are going on here, so hopefully that will be fixed before too long. Either way, now we can see we are quite nicely free-falling here. Our speed is dropping to below 500 meters a second here. 340, I believe, is supersonic, so at this point we are no longer moving faster than speed of sound, and we're going to come down here over this mountainous region. It's absolutely fine. Last thing I need to do is deploy the parachute, and so I'm just waiting here. I don't want to deploy it too soon because I don't want to wait for ages as I'm dropping, but 5 kilometers, I'll press space once more. There we go. The parachute comes out. Don't worry, initially it will deploy in this half-open drogue stage. This is just to give you some initial slowing of your craft without putting too much force on the parachute. Then when you hit 1 kilometer above the surface, you see there it ballooned up nice and big in order to give the parachute's real effect, catching all that air, massively increasing your drag, therefore really lowering the maximum velocity or terminal velocity down to a nice manageable speed. With our nice little tiny pod here, 1 parachute is more than enough to slow us down. In this case we've got 7.5 meters a second. Our pod is going to survive that, no problem at all. Of course, as you get bigger and bigger re-entry vehicles, you might need more and more parachutes to slow them down. But otherwise at this stage I am now just completely hands off. I've got nothing to do but sit and watch the ground altitude steadily tick down, and again admire how pretty this game is, which I still am kind of blown away with. They've really done a good job at that. Go less than 100 meters to go, just going to gently drop down on this mountainside, just drop into the shadow of the mountain, and bonk. Nicely landed, all nice and safe. We are down and intact. Mission accomplished. Then final thing to do, if it doesn't prompt you, which occasionally seems to, you can just push the escape menu here and click recover vessel. There we go, it just gives you a little bit of a debrief there. So in this case we got up to 184 kilometers, our highest speed was 2000 meters per second, we travelled a total of 308 kilometers. Highest G-force experience here was 17.5 Gs, that was quite high. That would have been probably when we stopped and hit the ground there. That's exactly what we want to do, so we can just pop back to the tracking station. So there we have it, how to get into orbit for the first time in KSP2. I'd certainly like to do some more of these videos. The next one will probably be how to land on the moon and get back, and then maybe some extra planetary things of how to land on Duna and get back in a little more of a tutorial way than my current videos. So if you like this and found it useful, please do let me know. The comment or a like really does help. And otherwise I hope to catch you in future videos. Until then, remember to be kind to yourselves and everyone else. Cheers.